And welcome. Good evening. Professor Samuel Jones, Director of the Center for Research on Latin America and the Caribbean. And on behalf of CERLAT, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 2026 Michael Baptista Lecture. We're grateful that you've joined us for what promises to be a timely, urgent, and intellectually rich conversation. Before we begin, however, I'd like us to engage in a moment of reflection through our land acknowledgements. I invite Tika Pinnock, PhD candidate and FERLAC research associate, to guide us through this process.
Good evening, late afternoon, everyone. So York, by the way, has been gifted new land acknowledgements by the Mississauga that credit. So I'll be reading a part of that as well as my own reflections, which I will invite you to share with me. So First Nations peoples have lived on this part of Turtle Island for millennia, stored in the land, the water, and all that contributes to life in this region. Today, the culture and presence of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples enrich the lands and people of this territory. More than 2 centuries ago, the Mississauga people welcomed settlers to this territory, providing sustenance and engaging in trade and commerce. Between 1781 and 1820, 8 treaties were signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, who opened their territory to settlement. Today, York University's Steele campus is located on Toronto Purchase Treaty number 13 lands and is situated on the traditional territory of the Wendat and Haudenosaunee. Treaty history is foundational, and it is our collective responsibility to honor the land as we honor and respect those who have gone before us, those who are here, and those who have yet to come. We are grateful for the opportunity to be learning, working, and thriving on this land, and we commit to learn the truth and be active in the process of reconciliation. And what does it mean to learn the truth and be active in the process of reconciliation? We start by recognizing that there are broken covenants with Indigenous nations that we must collectively seek to repair. Let us recommit to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, to acknowledging and honoring the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people in their communities, to remembering the survivors of and the unmarked graves uncovered and yet to be discovered at residential schools, and Indigenous communities who continue to make light in the face of colonial law, disinvestment in public systems, resource extraction, and ongoing dispossession. The land acknowledgement statement is only a small step in the direction of redress and restitution. As peoples from and to work in Latin America and the Caribbean, we must also commit to honoring and standing in solidarity with the Indigenous nations of the region and to supporting the region's ongoing fight to defend itself against colonialism and imperialism, which seeks to continue to plunder our lands, our waters, and our people. The forces of dispossession and exploitation are borderless, transcending space and time. So too must be our joint struggle to regulate systems that continue to perpetrate violence onto the peoples of these lands. Despite centuries of colonial theft and violence, this is still Indigenous land. It will always be Indigenous land. Indigenous people are not relics of the past. They are still here and will always be here. Indigenous resistance and resurgence are alive and well. And this evening, as we turn our gaze to Latin America and the Caribbean, let us take solace in knowing that our spirit of resistance and survival is alive and well too.
Thank you so much, Tika, for that thoughtful and sincere acknowledgement. The Michael Baptista Lecture has long served as an important space for critical and engaged scholarship at CERLAC. It honors the spirit and success of the late Michael Baptista and the value of rigorous public dialogue on the issues that shape the Caribbean and Latin America. These also remind us of the importance of historical depth, in making sense of contemporary crises. During the lecture each year, SERLAC awards the Michael Baptista Essay Prize to an outstanding scholarly essay of relevance to the area of Latin American and Caribbean studies at York University from a humanities, social science, business, or legal perspective. This year, we are excited to award this prize to an exemplary PhD candidate in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change, Natalie Wood. Natalie's paper, Tidal Relations, Pelagic Theories of the Black Atlantic, posits that the ocean, especially the Atlantic as the site of the Middle Passage, must be understood as a critical space for interpreting Black life, memory, trauma, resistance, and liberation. Natalie's essay ultimately contends that thinking through the ocean offers a powerful methodology for understanding Black contemporary struggle and imagining more just, reparative, and life-affirming worlds. Natalie, congratulations on a brilliant manuscript.
All right. Okay.
The 2026 Baptista Lecture, Crude Tactics, Venezuela, the US, and the Future of Resource Sovereignty in the Americas, invites us to consider one of the most enduring, contentious questions in the political life of the region: the relationship between power, intervention, and sovereignty. At a moment of profound geopolitical uncertainty, this evening's discussion requires that we think carefully not only about Venezuela, but also about the wider histories and futures of democracy, imperial power, and justice in the Americas. This evening, we are privileged to have Professor Antulio Rosales, Assistant Professor in York's Department of Social Science, Business and Society, as our moderator. Professor Rosales works extensively on Venezuela's political economy, as well as the expansion of mining frontiers, gold extraction, and sanctions in the context of crises and political contestation. It is my pleasure to hand over the rest of the evening's proceedings to you, Antulio.
Thank you, Tamika. That was a great introduction. Thank you for your generosity. And I have to say, Natalie, I was privileged to sit in the awards committee. And if everybody, if you have the opportunity to read that paper, please do. It's an amazing article, and it stayed with me for a long time. So thank you for that work, and congratulations for doing that. Okay, so thank you again. I am most honored to be here, invited by Select, to be the moderator of this year's Baptista lecture. Most importantly, I wanted to thank Select and the Baptista lecture committee, of course, for the opportune decision to focus the lecture this year on the situation in Venezuela and its hemispheric implications. As you may suspect, for many Venezuelans and for Venezuelans all around the world, we've spent the past 12 weeks talking nonstop in our WhatsApp chats and in other forms of communications, Telegram and text messages on Zoom and so on. We have also lost quite a bit of sleep, and we've woken up in the middle of the night several times, and we have continued what seems to be a never-ending conversation about this country, about Venezuela, about democracy, about the prospects for a more inclusive country for us all. So it is because of that that I am, as part of one of the in-house Venezuelans and in-house Venezuelanists, But I am extremely grateful to Starbucks for bringing these conversations that have remained in many of our chat groups from those WhatsApp conversations out into a public facing event like this. So I'm most grateful for that. And I'm, of course, extremely honored to introduce our two amazing speakers today, Alejandro Velasco and Professor Laura McDonald. So, like as I was saying, many people working on Venezuela from the diaspora. I met Alejandro through online conversation. That's how we met. And I was telling him that we usually think we know each other far more intensely than what we actually know. So we see each other just a couple of times in our lives. So we've engaged in long-winded conversations, sometimes even heated discussions. We get into each other's skins and so on. But no matter the topic, I keep coming back to Alejandro's uh, analysis and non-complacent and very critical understanding of Venezuela's situation. And I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to always go back to what he's thinking. I am also glad to host him. He's also comes from the same hometown as I do in Venezuela. But I have to say one thing. Let you go easily with this. One thing I cannot let go of is that recently he was hosting a podcast. He was telling his entire life story. Uh, Together with the history of Venezuela. That's something that I'm sure he will do a little bit about here. But as a true Maracayero, I cannot forgive you for one thing. It's the fact that you shamelessly said in that podcast that you cheered for the lyrics in Caracas instead of the beloved Tigres Cerrado, which of course is my team. So you're not forgiven. But going on a more serious note, Alejandro Velasco is an associate professor at your university's Caracas School and the Department of History. He's a former executive editor of NACLA Report on the Americas. His research in the areas of social movements, urban politics, and democratization has won support from the Social Science Research Council, the Ford and Mellon Foundations, and the American Historical Association, among others, and has appeared in journals including the Hispanic American Historical Review, the Latin American Research Review, Later, and others. And most of you may know him because of his third book, which is a remarkable story on the history of Venezuelan social movements and the a particular popular urban center or urban area in Caracas, and the relationship between the building of that urban area with Venezuela's history and Venezuela's democracy. The book Barrio Rising, Urban Popular Politics and the Making of Modern Venezuela, published by California University Press, won the 2016 Fernando Coronil Prize for Best Book of Venezuela, awarded biannually by the section on Venezuelan Studies of the Latin American Association. A frequent media contributor, his editorials and analysis have appeared in NACLA, Nueva Sociedad, The Nation, The New York Times, The Washington Post, Current History, and others. Velasco also frequently contributes radio and television commentary in outlets including NPR, MSNBC, Al Jazeera, CBS, France 24, the BBC, and importantly, the CBC here for us in Canada. And I'm also very pleased to have one of Canada's foremost experts on Latin America and hemispheric relations, Professor Laura McDonald, who will be our discussant today. She's a long-time friend of this house, and I can also say that she's possibly the best possible, best accidental fellow traveler. About 10 years ago, I went to Mexico City for a conference. And when I was sitting down on my plane, I realized she's great. Laura was there with her amazing partner. And we planned to meet a day later. And we spent the entire day walking around the city. And it was one of the most memorable conference tours I've ever had. I hope we can repeat that at this point. Thank you, Mary. And Laura is a chancellor's professor in the Department of Science at the Institute of International Political Economy at Carleton University. She has a PhD in political science from New York University, and has published numerous books on global society, social politics, and citizenship struggles in Latin America, gender and trade, Canada and American relations, and the political impact of North American integration. Her current research, fascinating work, is funded by a Shared Insight grant, involves analysis on the 2019 labor reform in Mexico and the role of the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement in promoting labor rights in the region. We thought it was not here. She was past president of the Canadian Association of Latin American Studies in the Caribbean, Caracas, and a research associate with the Canadian Center for Policy Studies, and of course a Sarlacc. So join me in welcoming Alejandro, who will be speaking for 5 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion conversation for 15, and then we'll open for Q&A. Thank you.
That's really generous all around. Thank you so much, Antonio and Nika, for the invitation and lovely welcome, and Camila for all of your organization. Laura, I look forward to our discussion. And it's okay that you don't forgive me for reading your awareness, but the reality is. Okay, so on January 3rd of this year, Venezuela was attacked by the United States in a pre-dawn raid of special forces joined with law enforcement operatives. U.S. warships and personnel flew into the densely populated valley of Caracas, which is a mountainous area. And can we get the video? Very mountainous area. Upwards of 8 low-flying, slow-flying commando helicopters flew towards the west part of the valley, highly fortified area known as Fuerte Tiuna, a military base where President Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores, resided. After a fierce gunfight, which left dozens of people dead, mostly Cuban special forces that had been attached to Maduro's security detail, as well as Venezuelan officers. After that gunfight, Maduro and his wife were put into a helicopter, were flown to a waiting ship off the coast of Venezuela. From there, onward to Puerto Rico, and then put on a plane to New York City, where he and Cilia Flores are currently being held after being indicted in a series of charges. It's important to recall, even though the magnitude and the dramatic nature of this raid, that the number of deaths, though not as high as we may have feared initially, was in fact quite large. Over 100 people died in this raid, as I mentioned before. Mostly soldiers, many of them Cubans, but also upwards of 30 civilians that died with bombs dropped not only in Caracas, but in other parts of Venezuela as well. Slide. Now, in the hours after the arrest, capture, seizure of Nicolás Maduro, and his wife, the United States government, especially through Secretary of State Marco Rubio, described what had happened not as a commando raid, not as a kidnapping, but as a law enforcement operation that had yielded the arrest of had been, at least according to him, a fugitive of the law. It is in words matter, and it is important to register that there is no legal precedent for a head of state, and we can talk about whether or not their legitimacy of that head of state is in place, indicted in a foreign country's laws, under a foreign country's laws, can be extracted by that foreign country to face the justice of that other country. There is no legal precedent for that. There's also, it's worth mentioning, no international law that allows this to happen, contrary to the United States government's assertions. Maduro was not indicted at any international tribunal. There's no international arrest warrant for Nicolás Maduro. There is a case in the International Criminal Court, but it's in the preliminary stages. So there is no legal precedent for the action that took place on January 3rd. And of course, there's also very little legal precedent for the actions that preceded the dramatic events of January, which encompassed the largest deployment of U.S. military personnel for a non-training purpose, which is to say kinetic purpose, in the 21st century, in the Caribbean and in Latin America. Upwards of 15,000 troops and personnel in different parts of the Caribbean were positioned, as well as parts of the Pacific. The largest aircraft carrier group Ronald Reagan was also deployed for the first time, again, not for training purposes, but for kinetic purposes. Again, it is not only unprecedented in the 21st century, but very few historical presidents going back to the 20th century. You can think of this particular operation leading up to the January 3rd raid. Now, the magnitude of this operation, in some ways, was the significance of its magnitude, that it seemed to be an operation in search of a reason. And over the few months that the operation was building up, that was taking place, the United States government resorted to a series of, I call it, the greatest hits of U.S. interventions and wars, years in Latin America. At various moments in the lead up to the January 3rd raid, Donald Trump and others in its administration issued forward explanations such as Venezuela's emptying its jails and sending its criminals to the United States to wreak havoc on U.S. society. Fentanyl, which of course does wreak massive amounts of havoc in the United States, was designated as a weapon of mass destruction, formally designated as such, which of course gives tremendous leeway to various law enforcement agencies of the United States to go outside of the law to engage in their operations. And then, of course, the idea was that Venezuela was both a producer and a distributor of fentanyl. Also, that Venezuela is a site or wait station for Hezbollah and Hamas terrorist cells drawn straight from the Sicario 2 plot of the movie in Cilia, where they were given Venezuelan passports and IDs, and they worked their way through Central America through the southern border to stage terrorist attacks in the United States. Then the idea that Nicolás Maduro was the head of a multinational drug cartel de los soles, so-called because of the sons that are the decorated the epaulets of generals in the Venezuelan military, and Nicolás Maduro was head of this massive cartel. And of course, then the kinetic exercise, which is a euphemism, but an important one, centered around so-called narco boats that were literally blown out of the water, certainly as a show of prowess and power by the U.S. military as it built up in the Caribbean. But again, much as said before, lacking any legal justification, even using the same discourse of the United States government. If these were drug running boats, they had to be engaged through courts, through warrants, and in fact, they were not. And as a result, these were just extrajudicial executions that were taking place for all of us to see with no legal basis. Same with the Cartel de los Soles explanation. The Justice Department, back after the kidnapping of Maduro, retracted the idea that there was even a Cartel de los Soles, admitted that this is in fact a creation of journalism going back to the 1980s to designate corrupt officers in militaries. There is zero documented evidence of anyone claiming to be Hamas or Hezbollah having U.S. Venezuelan identification documents. Venezuela is not only not a producer of fentanyl, but there's no fentanyl that traffics out of Venezuela. Venezuela's primary export in terms of drugs is cocaine, and that mostly goes to Europe, not to the United States. And there's also no evidence of certainly any concerted effort to quote unquote open Venezuela's jails, quite the opposite. There's lots of documentation of Venezuelan jails being tremendously overcrowded, extremely violent centers of crime and torture. So none of these explanations. But it was only around December that another explanation certainly came into the, which was oil. And it was very interesting the way that this happened. Certainly because it first came from the mouth of Donald Trump himself, whereas other explanations have been said by other members of his administration. But it was also the language that was used to describe why oil was the primary reason for this military buildup and potential intervention in Venezuela. As you see here, a long post that Donald Trump posted in mid-December, but also in this quote. They took our oil and we wanted that. You could parse the language of the tweet and subsequent explanations to suggest that there were expropriations of oil. U.S. oil companies happened either during the first nationalization of the oil industry in the 1970s or during a renationalization of the oil industry under Hugo Chavez, which I'll talk about in a moment, in the mid 2000s. But in both cases, certainly in the first, those were indemnified, and in the second, those were drawn out through legal processes. So there's nothing illegal about these. However, besides the point of legality, the important point here is that the oil itself is ours. There's an inherent claim to the notion of the oil that exists on the subsoil, inside the subsoil in Venezuela. It is ours, and we have dominion. So all this is to suggest that the January 3rd raid, and as dramatic as it was, presents us with a series of questions, melodies that mark before and after January. And the first question that we need to ask is, well, what has changed and what hasn't after January? This is a self-evident question and helps us to locate the significance of January 3rd, not only for Venezuela, but more broadly for the hemisphere and perhaps. So let's start with Venezuela. What has stayed the same in Venezuela? The reality that much, certainly on the surface, feels very risky. Beyond Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores, all of the major figures that were part of the Madurista government remain in place. Right? So, talk about regime change at large. The reality is the regime looks very much the same on the surface than it the day on January 4 as it did on January 6. Now, the significance of this similarity is forces us to consider what is it that the various players that are now in power in Venezuela, that were in power before, what is it that they bring to the table, and how might that account for why they remain in power? Let's begin with Delcy Rodriguez, who is now the acting president of Venezuela. And I say this in part not only because it is a legal truth, but also because she was sworn into this office on Monday, after the Saturday of the January 3rd raid, very, very quickly, and having to clear a Supreme Court, Venezuelan Supreme Court of Justice decision that legally vacated the president's and acknowledged that Maduro was unlikely to return. And as a result, he needed to fill this office, and Delcy Rodriguez, as vice president, was going to assume office. The Constitution of Venezuela also calls for new elections to be held 30 days after. There's no indication that is happening. So it's very clear that her position as president is not an interim one, but rather it's one that's going to be maintained. Why might this be the case? In part because it's what she brings to the political landscape in terms of her background. She served as Minister of the Economy at a moment in Venezuela when hyperinflation was upwards of 68,000%. And really was one of the major architects of a process of stabilization through the dollarization of the economy. And in that sense, it's seen also, certainly outside of Venezuela, as a much more moderate economic figure than other players in the Venezuelan government. She also, very importantly, served as Minister of Hydrocarbons and President of PDVSA, which allows her not only knowledge of the oil industry, but contacts in the oil industry, including U.S. oil companies like Chevron, which have remained in Venezuela even in the context of sanctions and other U.S. companies leaving Venezuela for the last 15 to 20 years. And that knowledge, intimate knowledge of the oil industry and that moderate approach to the economy, really well position her in this moment of post-Maduro transition to be able to negotiate some level of stability and continuity. Another major player is Jorge Rodriguez, who is the president of the National Assembly. It's been held in office for many years. But the significance about Jorge Rodriguez is that he, unlike his sister, has significant amount of personal charisma that dates all the way back to his years as the student leader in the 1980s, the 1990s in Venezuela. But even beyond that, his claim to power, his particular domain of agreement, is not only access to the National Assembly, but the National Assembly's abilities to change and implement laws very, very quickly. I'll talk about in a moment, that has become absolutely central in shaping a post-Maduro landscape. Another major figure is Vladimir Lopez Maduro, who holds the distinction of being the longest serving Minister of Defense in Venezuelan history, and was trying to see if I could think I can do this. The longest serving Minister of Defense in Latin America, other than Pinochet. What's significant about Lopez Maduro as Minister of Defense is that he commands not just a military apparatus, but he commands a military that in the years since Maduro became president in 2013, has been transformed into far more of an economic entity than a military entity. Many sectors of the military, in order for Maduro, who had very few connections to the military, unlike, of course, Hugo Chavez, who came from the military, were provided with tremendous grants and access to areas, to control over geographies, including as a tremendous work, and highlighting the extent to which military rules over certain vast swaths of the Amazon in order to extract natural resources. And in doing so, the military has far more become much like the Egyptian military, in an economic way rather than the military. And the significance of him remaining in power is that he can quell and command those generals who might otherwise be spoilers in a transition that would require them to lose access to these resources and to geography, to, again, to be subjugated to a new. And then there is Diosdado Cabello, who's the Minister of the Interior, Justice, and Peace. And his trajectory goes all the way back to the early days of Chavez's rise to power. As a member of the group that first staged a coup d'etat in 1992 that Chavez led. He rose through the ranks of chavismo, had tremendous megaphone in a TV show called Culmination, where he lambastes against political opponents, calls for arrest of opponents of the government, really tries to have a very strong ideological line around Chavismo. But significantly, he controls the courts, and he also controls vast important police and paramilitary forces in Venezuela called colectivos. And these paramilitary forces, especially over the last 10 to 12 years, have become absolutely central to regime stability in Venezuela. And to the extent that Cabello can control them, is the ability to provide stability to a context that might otherwise be highly uncertain. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that the one president who did not have his own area agreement, but whose remit primarily was to keep all these other sectors in line and working together, was Nicolás Maduro. He himself in any particular area of power, unlike all of these who in some ways check and balance one another. And so for him, leaving the scene provides for the others an opportunity to enter the stage in ways that they had not been able to before. But mostly, most importantly, what collectively they provide is regime stability. And the reason why this is important, of course, is that the alternative, another person who you see in this image, is Maria Corina Machado, the Nobel Prize laureate, secure award from Medal to Donald Trump. Make January to play to try to gain his graces. Importantly, Maria Corina Machado was then here in the left and further here. He was there present the swearing-in ceremony of Pedro Garbanzo briefly to one as president briefly after the overthrow of Hugo Chavez in April of 2002. She also helped to stage a recall referendum in 2004 against Chavez, which she claimed Chavez won fraudulently without evidence. Helped to lead a sector of the opposition to stage boycotts of parliamentary elections, which eventually helped Chavismo win complete control over the National Assembly. And so she's really oscillated in her time in the political scene in Venezuela between democratic and anti-democratic efforts, always to try to oust not only Chavez, but Chavismo writ large. Of course, she also became the most popular opposition figure in Venezuela around 2023 in anticipation of elections, presidential elections that happened in 2024. She was barred from running by the Maduro government. she placed a representative to run in her stead. He, by all accounts, happily engaged in conversation on this, won those elections resounding to say that Maduro did not win those elections. And nevertheless, he remained in power. Maria Corina Machado helped to engineer a kind of fracture of the opposition between those who remain in Venezuela and those who are outside Venezuela. Very different incentive structures between one and the other. Talk about it. So those are things that don't seem to have changed in Venezuela. But the reality is that much has changed dramatically and substantively over the last 2 months. And when I say 2 months, I'm talking about this before, it just seems like that Lenin quote, right? That there are weeks when decades happen and there are decades when nothing happens. Certainly, the decades have happened in the last 2 months. But there are very significant changes that we've seen over the last 2 months. Certainly in the area where the changes have been dramatic. The National Assembly, as I mentioned before, by Rodriguez, very quickly, let's just say within 2 weeks, approved a new hydrocarbons law that overturned the hydrocarbons law that Hugo Chavez passed in 2007, granting far greater concessions to foreign oil companies than certainly the 2007 law. Oil shipment to Cuba, which, as perhaps you have seen, were absolutely essential to providing a lifeline to the Cuban government, really to the Cuban people. Those have stopped completely, creating a tremendously precarious situation for Cubans in the island. Also, discounted oil to China, sales of oil to China, which accounted for the bulk of Venezuela's oil exports, have stopped. And all of that oil that was previously being sold at a discount to China is now going to the United States at no discount. Also, Maduro era, not only oil but also gas deals, especially in the area between Venezuela and Trinidad and Tobago, have been suspended and are subject now to revision and to passing in a different light. And key sanctions that the United States government placed on Venezuelan oil industry have been lifted. These might not seem like major, but they are in fact quite significant. Venezuela's oil is characterized as being extra heavy crude, which is to say, when it comes out of the ground, you have to undergo an initial stage of refinement before it can even be turned into something that could be called, for instance, gasoline or derivatives. And in order to do that, you need special products to be able to reach that level of refinement. That was a key sanction item for Venezuela under the U.S. sanctions regime imposed in 2017. That has been lifted, which allows Venezuela now to refine in ways that it hadn't. But there's been other major changes. Certainly not all, but a very sizable number of political prisoners have been released. An amnesty law that was approved by including some members of the opposition that are part of the National Assembly passed. Who knows if this will happen, but certainly Delcy Rodriguez has announced the Helicoide, which is the primary side of the Venezuela's political police, where most high-profile political opponents have been jailed, tortured, or killed, is going to be closed. And it's going to be repurposed as a site of memory. There's also been the firing of generals that Maduro had appointed in his. And this is a very significant marker, and certainly signal to others to come into line with what the new regimes that looks a lot like the old regime, but it's implementing different policies, is going to put into practice. And there's also been the resignation of some key officials, like that of William Saab, who's the Attorney General, as a potential spoiler to efforts to promote, for instance, amnesty or revision of laws that might allow for the political opposition, or at least a sector of the political opposition, to re-engage in the political game. But perhaps, especially if you are mind that Venezuela is mostly characterized by anti-Americanism, imperialism, the most dramatic, whiplashy difference has been the relationship with the United States. And here, it was many, but I'll just highlight a few that you see here. In a joint effort with the FBI, the Venezuelan political police arrested Alex Saab, who had been a close associate of the Nicolás Nicolás Maduro and his government for charges of corruption. He had already been indicted and arrested in the state, but then recently reported, so he was rearrested in this joint operation. None other than the director of the Central Intelligence Agency was greeted in red carpet treatment in Caracas a few weeks back. The Secretary of Energy as well towards several oil refineries, oil extractive sites in Venezuela at the hand of Delcy Rodriguez and others. Announcement that the U.S. Embassy, which has been closed since 2018, was reopening. It's created widely with support throughout among Venezuelans. And just last week, Trump, amid a broad and full-throated support of Delcy Rodriguez doing a wonderful job as a brilliant woman, announced that diplomatic relations are going to be restored fully with Venezuela, which opens the door not only for Delcy to be recognized formally as president, but also for Venezuela to now regain control of frozen assets in the dispute that had happened in 2019 around who was the legitimate president of Venezuela. So these are significant changes, perhaps none more so than the elimination, especially on the part of the higher officials in government, any kind of anti-imperialist discourse that have been a long-standing thread and hallmark of Chavista elite talk and discourse. So how do we make sense of any of this, let alone all of this? A bit of a shameless plug. And this is not to suggest any kind of preference, but sometimes history does help us to think a little bit about it. In 2022, I published a very long piece in Macro Report as part of a larger special issue, revisiting Chavismo, reassessing it from the left. And one of the things that I argued in that piece, thinking about the long history of Chavismo, not just from the time that Chavez was elected in 1998, but in the decades prior as well, and what they try to do for Venezuela, is that it's actually quite important for us not to think of Chavismo as a rigid ideological thought, and that to do so misses what is a far more stable and fundamental hallmark of Chavismo, which is adaptation. We're going to go over some of that adaptation as a way to highlight this argument. But beyond this question, which will animate the rest of my presentation, there are other questions that surface, especially trying to make sense of why this shift is happening in the Venezuelan government. One might be, well, they don't have any choice. There's still this massive armada mounted right outside of the coast of Venezuela. There's still the threat of further intervention. There are still significant sanctions against the Venezuelan government, ability to run affairs as normal. There is very much the potential that Venezuela becomes a backward state, right? I would submit to you that they do have a choice, right? And we have seen historical precedents of governments, Cuba and others, fighting back, right? But the reality is that there was no effort on January 3rd or since for anyone in the Chavista elite to give the order or for themselves to either directly or indirectly resist U.S. intervention. This is an undisputed fact, which is highlighted also by the fact that in the months prior to January 3rd, almost everything that we have seen happen since was actually already on the table with negotiations between Maduro and the Trump administration in terms of concessions on U.S. oil companies, concessions for the political opposition. But the sticking point was always Maduro himself. He continued to assert that he had to lead his transitional moment rather than somebody that until of course he became too toxic and therefore needed to be removed in order for these other possibilities to take. So then maybe the question is, well, it's about political survival, right? It's about the survival of the regime. And this is about, I think, the case, but in context. Not just for the sake of survival for its own sake, but rather political survival for profit of Chavismo, again, whose hallmark is adaptation over time rather than a rigid ideological program. Now, the image that I think today we might have of Chavismo, something akin to what you see here. Chavismo as a long-standing, perhaps, preternatural, socialist, anti-American, an anti-imperialist movement from the start. But I will suggest to you that it is inaccurate and willfully false to suggest that Chavismo was a cohesive political project, certainly from the start, or in a very important way, perhaps ever since it came to power. Instead, again, it's adaptation, not ideology, characterized the primary feature. And it's changing over time with the larger aim of capturing and controlling the state as an end for safety purposes, which delineates how Chavismo has evolved during its time in power and how it might be evolving again in this very seemingly uncertain moment that might otherwise give us tremendous amounts of political and ideological whiplash. The reality is that as much as we might remember the quote from Chavez at the United Nations calling for the devil or girls that he wants to see here, or the proclamation of the socialism of the 21st century, Venezuela was not, and Chavez himself was not inherently anti-American. He, in fact, had significantly warm relations with Bill Clinton during the time that they overlapped in office. When Obama was elected, came into office, tried to launch those relations. Perhaps you might recall that he famously gave a copy of Open Veins of Latin America to Obama at a summit meeting at the state of Latin America, or of the Americas. But it was through a series of interventions by the United States, beginning in April 2002, the coup that condemning the bombing campaign of Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks, that Chavez in particular began to assert a much more contingent and specific form of anti-Americanism rather than a broad-based ideology. In part, you can see here, because, or as evidenced by the fact that Venezuela never stopped selling oil to the United States during Chavez's time in only two moments when Venezuela's exports to the United States dropped. One was during the oil industry strike led by the opposition, 2002 and 2003, and then later after the U.S. imposed sanctions in 2017. The Chavez and Venezuela were dutiful and religious suppliers of oil to the United States. It's hard to hold in balance a strident anti-American discourse while at the same time also helping to prop up the regime that you are dismissing. It's also difficult to assert that Venezuela was broadly and successfully socialist in a command economy sort of way. Now, of course, it is absolutely the case, as I'll show you in a minute, that the human index indicators and quality of life massively improved under Chavismo in Venezuela for most Venezuelans. But mostly it has to do with the vast availability of petrodollars that came to Venezuela beginning in 2003 to 2004, and its use and distribution to the larger population through social programs that were targeted and broad-based the result of this tremendous influx of petrodollars. But the reality is that at its peak, Venezuela's industry was always mostly in private control. The greatest amount of public corporations put the economy at 30% in public hands. 70% of the economy, including its banks, including telecommunications, including other services, key services, were in private control. There's also the question of massive contradictions around the huge boom in consumer spending, consumerism more broadly, while at the same time a discourse of socialism was taking place. So simultaneously, Chavez was talking about how being rich is bad, but also with the vast availability of liquidity in Venezuela's economy, many people were making use of that liquidity to purchase goods, services. More significantly, we have to pay attention to Chavez's own words. It's a really great encapsulation. Chavismo, in fact, always held dueling strands within it. As much as we may or may not want to admit it, is an authoritarian strand and a democratizing strand. Both of these were in the heart of Chavismo, going back to Chavez's time in the military and certainly extending to his time in power. But Chavez was always the mediator between these two strands. Okay? The question was going to be which strand was going to win out in any given moment. And what I have now is various stages of chavismo to give some sense of these dueling strands battling out for one another, eventually leading to this moment where we're now with the United States asserting greater claim on Venezuela with the seeming support of those who remain in power. The first stage is called Chavismo Bolivarian, which was actually said before Chavez takes office in 1999. Really, it's marked by three major features that coincide with Chavez's not just rise to power, but its own formative stages. As a cadet, he was very influenced by reformist militarism, playing places like Peru under the regime of Juan Velasco Alvarado, or in Panama, the regime of Barbados, which really alerted Chavez to the idea that the military could be deployed at the service of social justice rather than state power. That coincided with a sense of revolutionary vanguard, learned primarily from brother Chavez, who was very much aligned with Marxist guerrillas in Venezuela. And the idea that a vanguard, a revolutionary vanguard, could bring, and in fact was should be responsible for bringing around changes, structural changes, not only to Venezuela, but to. And then it was laced with a Bolivarian nationalism, the idea that Bolivar and the cultural primacy of Bolivar as a symbolic figure unifying Venezuela's popular and political culture could bring these various threads together. This is broadly what we understand by the antecedents of Bolivarianism or Chavismo as it comes to power. But once it does come to power in 1999, Bolivarianism is transformed into something slightly different in practice, which is participatory democracy. First stage of Chavismo power, yes, it draws on this Bolivarian discourse and practice, but in practice, it tries to implement itself through these mechanisms that graph onto these dueling strands of authoritarianism and democratization. They strengthen simultaneously the executive branch, extending, for instance, the presidential term from 5 to 6 years, eventually abolishing term limits, while also implementing by constitutional right the ability of citizens themselves to stage referenda, be able to, and in fact, need to be consulted on key decisions of the state. But again, mediated through the state rather than through bottom-up forces alone. And these three stages of participatory democracy in some ways set the stage for the next stage. I'll talk about in a minute. But in the beginning stage of foundation, you have a new constitution that again enshrines this tension between a strengthened executive and an empowered citizenry. You have the aim of greater state capacity through the relaunching of PDVSA, and it's this specifically OPEC, the oil cartel, in order to boost oil prices, which have reached a low of $8 per barrel in 1998. And in fact, a oil rebound of the economy, in Chavismo in particular, to actually place significant amounts of improvements through the hands of this new constitutional arrangement. But that leads to a reaction on the part of opposition sectors, which, as I talked about before, and many others, whereas one particular example, through a coup, through an oil industry strike, through a recall referendum, progressively withdraw themselves from the political scene, as well as are withdrawn forcibly and by coercion by Chavismo itself. And then finally, a consolidation period between 2004 and 2006, which coincides with the largest boom in petrodollar that Venezuela and the world has ever seen. Venezuela reached upwards of $1 trillion income coming as a result of Venezuela's reliance on oil. It's, of course, not coincidental that that's also the moment which Chavismo transforms itself once again. Not only as Bolivarian, but now as participatory, but now as so-called socialism of the century, which becomes the banana. Visually, that Chavismo now holds aloft as a new form of political arrangement. And this is marked by many particular features that are specific to Venezuela, also more broadly spared, the establishment of the PSV, Partido Socialista Único de Venezuela, Unido de Venezuela, the upholding and uplifting of communal councils now as a form of a communal state, but nevertheless still highly dependent on oil rents in order to jumpstart and to sustain itself, which of course makes it highly susceptible to those oil rents dropping. This, of course, is happening in the hemispheric context of left-wing governments coming to power, coming into solidarity. We now call it the pink tide. But it also lays a profound contradiction. Just as this socialism of the 21st century is taking center stage, consumerism in Venezuela and elsewhere is exploding again as a result of the vast availability of petrodollars in the economy. It also comes at a moment when there is zero accountability in the Venezuelan government. There's no institutions, both by design and then also by attrition, that the office controls in the government to be able to withhold or to check the power of the state. Reported at the height of this, 2013, Hugo Chavez dies and gives rise to, or gives way to Nicolás Maduro, his former foreign minister, later vice president, to assume office. And the story here in some ways is well worn, but it's important to recall Maduro did not have any of the political capital or political charisma that Hugo Chavez held. He also had no contacts with the military, which allowed for Chavez to consolidate power more broadly. And as a result, he also had significant amounts of vulnerabilities, which he responded to in terms of mediating the spread between authoritarianism and democratization, not by deepening the democratizing currents, but by strengthening the authoritarian. Here's what I was talking about before, so you can reconfiguration of the military and military forces as well, police become the primary bedrock to remain in power. Remaining in power becomes the primary raison d'etre for chavismo and for Maduro during this time period. That leads to an escalating spiral of repression, protest, repression, and protest, which leads to, as we see, or seeing, tremendous amounts of political instability as well as economic instability. The one constant in every period that I've described is the countries. Venezuela's tremendous dependence on many ways to describe its dependence. It's difficult sometimes to calculate. Here are just two ways to think about it. First, the close correlation between human development indicators and the price of oil. There's quite clear correlation when oil prices rise in Venezuela, the conditions of living, when they decline, conditions of living decline as well. Likewise, there's significant correlation between Venezuela's GDP and the price of oil, which again highlights the extent to which Venezuela's economy is completely tied to the vicissitudes of oil. And so tremendous reliance on oil has made it not an independent nation, but quite the opposite, highly dependent not only on oil, but on those fluctuations that geopolitically oil occasions. Which then brings us back to the beginning, so to speak. January 3rd, this new regime that looks similar to the old regime, but in practice has made changes to accrue to it. And the reality is that there's many of those different scenarios forward in the next months, perhaps as many as 18 months from now. There's a high possibility of significant economic recovery. It does not take much for Venezuela's economy to recover, especially given the depths of prices that it has faced. I'll just give you one quick example. So one of the oil tankers that the United States seized was sold in the market for $300 million, which came by way of Qatar. Happy to talk about that in Q&A. To Venezuela, which was then distributed through the economy, through financial systems and mechanisms. That had a huge impact on the economy, $300 million. Now, again, going from a place of tremendous crisis, the opportunities for recovery are not that difficult to come by. You don't need, for instance, to massively generate production of oil in order to get more benefits or more revenues. All you have to do is not sell the oil at a discounted rate, which is what the United States is saying that Venezuela's oil should be sold at. Which might lead to the most improbable outcome of all, which is in the context of eventual elections, Venezuela leaders wins political capital enough to the process of recovery and through these changes that chavismo and then see when elections happen. Right? This is the scenario that I think that chavismo is trying to play. Right? That it's not so much an ideological mission of anti-imperialism or anti-Americanism, but one of adaptation and political survival for the potential of improving more broadly situation economically that might allow it to come back to power. I'll end with this. Of course, all this is happening in an extremely different political context than we've seen for certainly the 21st century, perhaps had to go back to earlier in the 20s. Venezuela continued, as I mentioned, to be absolutely dependent on, which creates a chimera of sovereignty. It's a sovereignty that is always conditioned on the vicissitudes of oil prices and oil markets. With that kind of sovereignty, your vulnerability, external pressure, internal one, will always be pronounced. So it really forces us to consider what we understand by sovereignty in the context of resource dependence. But it's happening at a moment when the United States is asserting a different kind of claim and purchase, not only on the hemisphere, really on what the world is going to look like in the future. I don't know how many of you read the national security strategy when it came out back in November. I will confess to you that I only skimmed it at the time. I read it in quite significant detail on January 3rd. And what is amazing and surprising is that often, as historians, we have to read between the lines, read into subtext. Here, everything is being said quite loudly and quite plainly. It's highlighted two portions of itself. It's not a long document, it's 22 pages, so I really encourage you all to read it. But they're saying the things that they want, and they're saying how they're going to get it, and the justifications behind it. There's no basis in legality. In fact, quite the opposite. It's based on a projection of pure power. Going back to that quote from Trump, where natural resources are our natural domain. We have inherent domain in the natural resources of our skin, and we have the power and the wherewithal to take it. This is forming part of this larger landscape, which, again, because of the vulnerabilities of sovereignty as a result of oil dependency, is making Venezuela far more susceptible to this particular moment in U.S. foreign policy. But again, I think it has to be understood again in the context, not of a coercion completely, but also an adaptation of change. Both of these two are in play at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alejandro. Now we have Laura to give a discussion response, and then we start engaging in conversation.
Yeah. Many thanks, Alejandro, and thanks to Sarah. It's really fantastic to be here again. I feel like I'm coming home. When I come here, I believe we did not have anywhere near as nice a building. There's so people, you guys are doing it. So it's really the best place to be to analyze and weigh what are the events that are taking our hemisphere as we speak. And they do not stop happening. Like it's hard to keep up, like you said, the line close. Please slow down. Like we need time to breathe and reflect, but we don't really have, so we need to reflect quickly. Just quick disclaimer, I am not a Venezuelanist by any means, so please forgive me. I make any errors, and most of what I'm going to say is reflecting more on the hemispheric context of what is happening right now, in which, as Alejandro correctly says, the events in Venezuela are layered onto the other events happening right now in the hemisphere. So some pause provoked by Alejandro's presentation, which was amazing. Also, this amazing article in NACA, which he shamelessly promoted, and I recommend that you go and read that very long article. I've never seen such a long article. I don't know how you got that in there. He was doing it, obviously, and all the power again.
I love that Ari sit down. My influence on me. Clearly.
A good Latin American
Yes.
classic. No, it's an amazing article. I highly recommend it as an amazing overview of Venezuelan history. As a good historian, he in that article in here emphasizes elements of continuity that weigh over the Chavista period of Venezuelan history from previous eras. We didn't really talk about that here today, but in general, what we see seeping through this politics is that are the perverse incentives and politics that are created by the enormous rents that are fostered by the oil economy. As good political economists, and Tulio and I, especially Tulio, knows about this whole literature on curse, the Dutch disease, the association between inflated rents and violence and autocracy as diverse actors compete, using often very questionable methods for control of those rents. And in this context, democracy and social justice seem to be elusive, ever elusive objectives, even if we see them before us at moments and then they're grasped from us. I always tell my students that the open veins story that Chavez gave Obama, the open veins of Latin. Again, if any of you have not read that, I highly recommend it, but it just seems so poignant and so tragic that here he is passing this great work of dependency theory to Obama and saying this is our history, and yet cannot overcome that history. Venezuela, instead of finding a way to diversify their economy, and develop say agriculture, instead just doubles in on oil production. And it's understandable because there it is, all the wealth is in. But we know the nature of the resource economy. And as this so it seems almost irresistible. I someone emphasizes all the time agency in history. I find it striking, but maybe we could talk more about agency versus structure. Another thing that struck me is that the events in Venezuela these last couple of months remind us of the continued importance of the Latin American military. Those of us who studied Latin America in the earlier period of dictatorship were always thinking about the role of the military, but for a while in the eras of democratization and neoliberalization, that kind of slipped from view. We weren't thinking about the military all the time. They're still there, and they still have aspirations, and they still have many tools to wield to influence the political process. And we're seeing this again in the case of the new regime in Venezuela, but we also see that in a place like Mexico, where the populist left regime is held up by, I would say, with the military, which allows them to govern in exchange for more control over the economy and more leeway to engage in whatever actions they choose to adopt. So again, I think we need to think again, go back to those things, thinking about the military and their role in politics. They fairly have to study because they don't like being interviewed. So, and it's hard to figure out what they're actually doing. We need to work hard on this. Another point, Alejandro mentioned his NACA articles about the importance of NOTs. Well, how do we think about the US? Some versions of leftism see the United States as this powerful force, all powerful force that can do what it wants, and the kind of seems to be going on right now. But in the post-neoliberal or pink tide period, some authors began speaking about Latin America as a post-hegemonic region because of the United States seeming lack of interest in the Americas and turn towards other parts of the world, especially the Middle East after 9/11. People like the kind of elite Latin Americanists, like the American Society in the US, were always complaining, pay attention to us, you're not paying attention. We're so important. But be careful what you wish for.
because this is what has happened. We've seen the US turn its gaze like Sauron gaze back to Latin America and focusing so much negative energy and attention here. So it seemed for a while that Latin America wasn't of major interest, and Latin American states began to cooperate with each other, even back to the 80s, ending the wars in Central America. But there were always rivalries between different countries in the region, and there was a lot of difficulty developing any kind of coherent, concerted force to oppose the U.S. role. And this is, I think, becoming much more obvious in the last little while. The problems of achieving any kind of degree of Latin American and Caribbean cooperation against U.S. Aspirations. So this reality has become extremely clear to us in the era of 2.0, when the empire is seeking revenge, striking back, is my Star Wars reference. As Alejandro discusses, Trump's national security strategy identifies the Western Hemisphere as the US's main national security concern. Point number one in the national security strategy is controlling the hemisphere. Of course, since then, they've also decided they need to control everyone. But they're doing everything at once, which is quite kind of incredible. But this whole phase was presaged by the early, I think, quite telling over Trump's labeling the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America, right? So it portrayed very vividly the geostrategic, geopolitical gaze of the United States was from at least, but the US in general, of assuming that this is hemisphere. We are the ones in control, and we get to decide what's going to happen in this whole hemisphere. And this reflects kind of a neo-imperialist worldview, but also at the same time we have other currents in the administration like Marco Rubio mentioned. This now is coming at this from a slightly different political perspective, and who had for decades tried to promote routine change in Cuba, especially by other leftist regimes in Latin America. So you have a time between the Rubio vision, which is about regime change, and the Trump vision, which is about grabbing the oil. And there's a contest going on there. Of course, Trump's in charge, so he gets to decide. So we had the national security strategy come out, which was followed immediately, or almost immediately, by the incursion into Venezuela, and then followed by threats against Greenland, which, unlike the case of Venezuela, led to strong reaction from Canada and Western European countries who were outraged by the fact that Trump could even think about taking Greenland, whereas just like the US just marched into Venezuela, which was followed. And you read this Carney's statement about the Venezuela, which I keep saying it could have been written by a 22-year-old intern who wrote this thing. So basically said, we believe in international law. Okay, you would think that would say indicate that we don't support this in person. And we also hope that there will be a democratic outcome from this event, which is not happening. It's not on the Trump agenda. So it's very muddled approach, which is, I must say, in line with earlier liberal government position on Venezuela. It's very in line with the Venezuelan opposition, the Guaido, strong support for Guaido as the legitimate president. Anyway, so this is followed by Cuba. Cuba is, the blockade of oil to Cuba, which is causing this huge crisis. themselves because the US was going to do it. So that it led to the Mexican government hitting the Nueva Generación cartel, which, we don't know what's going to be. I don't have that. But anyone who's studied, efforts in the past to decapitate cartels, this has not gone well. And it could lead to a big upsurge of violence in Mexico, and Mexico could still see incursion by the US. And then, we had the lovely scenario very recently, again, you may not have noticed because it didn't get much coverage, but there was the meeting in Florida. Some 13 Latin American leaders at the Shield of the Americas event, sponsored and organized by the disgraced former Homeland Security Secretary Christine Noem. You can make this up. They named together some of the worst actors in the hemisphere to engage in embarrassing acts of obsequiousness. I'm not sure that's a word, but it's just it's similar to China handing over the Nobel Prize, just trying to find some way of deflecting his and gaining or gaining his approval. So at that meeting, they signed an agreement, a proclamation, which he described as a commitment to using lethal military force to destroy the sinister cartels and terrorist networks throughout the hemisphere. So it's not stopping in Mexico, it's not stopping in Cuba, it could be anywhere. And he touted the US military's amazing weaponry and just called on, begged almost these other American leaders to call him in other acts of violence. So, but back to this point, is the US powerful? No, because they're supported by this rogues gallery of diverse right-wing political actors who are supporting this action. So it's not the US opposing themselves entirely, it's that they're being called in. They are being called in by these actors. So where does this leave us? I don't know, but I think because I used up too much time, I will pass the word over to the audience, and we'll hopefully have a great discussion about what the implications are and where do we go next. Thank you.
All right. So I will leave you a chance to respond to Laura once we've picked up some questions from the audience about that. So how about we get a first round of 3 questions? I see Toma there. Is there any other hand? Okay. So Toma, could you start? Do you want the microphone? Yeah, so we need the microphones.
Here.
Right part there, yeah.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. Extremely eloquent of a very complex reality at the same time. So my question goes towards the conclusion, where you foresee the possibility of Delcy Rodriguez electoral victory. And I fully endorse the analysis of the evolution of chavismo. You read this first political program in 1998, and there's nothing about socialism. And then the evolution and so on and so forth. But here, we're not just talking about adaptation of discourse. We're talking about like a complete morphing of what chavismo had evolved to be about. Anti-imperialism, although they were selling oil to the US, anti-imperialism was central. Then all what the US did to foster this feeling, like the seizure of Citgo, stopping the gold reserve from in the Bank of England, all what they did is like extremely strong gestures. And then the limitation of sovereignty that you were referring to with respect to the fact that it's an oil country, now it's not just because of oil. It's because if I understand well, the deal is that the oil will be sold by the U.S. and the money will be kept in Qatar and given to the Venezuelan government pending the approval of the budget that they will submit to the U.S. And all that, and then they would still appear as being the legitimate ruler of the country to the eyes of the Chavista themselves. So what I don't get here is, okay, I've seen some Chavista events where it's amazing the attachment they have to the history, and you say, well, there is an ideological apparatus that works, but no fracture within Chavismo. Even with all this, you don't foresee anything of that.
No, I know you want to answer that, but we have another. Come, thank you, Tuma. And then Miguel over there. So we have.
This will be a much simpler question, and forgive me, it might be a silly question. So so my I guess two parts. My understanding very loosely was that there was some relationship between like Iran and Venezuela prior to Maduro. So I'm curious what the situation is today. And then I'm also, again, really naive question and very simplistic, but just before Maduro was taken, I think Christmas Day they bombed northern Nigeria. So another oil producing company, then Venezuela, now Iran, and all top oil places. And I guess my question is it about the oil per se, or is it because the US dollar is tied to oil and that could be a way of them trying to stabilize their economy?
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Alejandro. And it's a privilege to have you all be here. Sorry. So my question is about the role of China, Russia. You wrote that piece in 2019 in the New York Times, and you mentioned this regime change and the possibility for the US to counteract the influence of China, Russia. Do you mind sharing some of your thoughts today in terms of how they have responded? Right? I know the investments are significant, so maybe a little bit of your thoughts about that. Thank you, Alejandro, for your time and participating here in the Baptista lecture.
All right.
We'll do that round first, and then we'll do the next.
Yeah. So then we have later on we have Masaya there and Lisa. Okay.
Thank you for these. It's a great, an important and timely and urgent, really. I think your question is exactly the right one, which is, as I understand it, number one, what is left of the chavismo that for so long anchored its not only self-image, but its projection abroad to an ideological project of anti-imperialism, even if, as I was saying, and we can talk in much more depth about all the contradictions that lived under, whether it's resource dependency or the boom in consumerism tied to the socialist moment, or the need for the petro state to fund the tremendously exciting experiments in communal governance and local government that we saw under the others. And I think I would say that, I don't know, maybe Antonio, you've heard, or Masaya, or other folks who have contacts in Venezuela, I've yet to hear anyone bemoan that Maduro is no longer around. I just have not heard it. And, obviously I don't speak to everyone in Venezuela. I know there are people who do, but the there's a phrase in Spanish, and we talk about it in Venezuela. It's called destrancar el juego. And like el juego político estaba trancado, so stuck that it was completely unclear what would unstuck it. And most of what I've heard actually is about, well, something has happened and now it's unstuck and new possibilities are surfaced. Whether those possibilities are going to be a complete 180 over time, or we might see within the Delcy government new configurations to try to assert different forms of autonomy, or perhaps also to draw on even those very mediated resources that are coming, as you said, by way of Qatar, in order to deploy a different kind of political capital that will allow for the emergence of a different kind of that all of that is on the table in ways that I don't think were before. But your point is a good one, which is how do people, Chavistas or others, make sense of this dramatic contradiction? And I would say that they've been making sense of dramatic contradictions in Chavismo for a long time, right? Whether it's the contradictions that were associated with the collapse of a participatory model and the complete replacement of that in 2006, 2007 with socialism of the 21st century, that was actually a quite very massive adaptation that resulted in the only electoral loss that Chavez suffered in 2007 during the constitutional referendum. And he acknowledged it. And he did so. And you know, we can go back to to that moment. What was on the table was a vision for a socialist state, and it was not approved under the first referendum. And so, you know, I think that you're right, but I just don't think that it's an unprecedented switch. And I think it also does not comport to, again, a sense that the essence of Chavismo is rooted in anti-imperialism. It was at one time. I'll just say this one anecdote. I remember I was at a conference at Berkeley in 2006, and it was about Chavismo and, you know, where it was going. And of course, at the time, everyone was talking about socialism of the 21st century. And at the time, Tulio Halperindongui who was an extremely prominent Latin American historian, Argentine historian. He gave the closing remarks, and throughout the 2 days of the conference, this is an older gentleman. He just stood in the back or sat in the back, taking it in, didn't take a single note. And at the end, he came up and just like sat down, and for 40 minutes gave the most lucid, coherent articulation of what he distilled Chavismo to be, and basically said, listen, you're going to have Chavismo for decades in the same way that we had Peronismo for decades in Argentina. And so I do think that that's more likely if we dispense with a kind of fixation on pure ideology. What we might be seeing actually is the reconfiguration, or perhaps just the consolidation of Chavismo as a populist political project that can, as Peronismo has, adapted very massively over time, or, you know, not so much the PRI, but certainly Peronismo. But you may be right too. So we shall see. I have no idea. Iran and Venezuela, thank you for that question. I should say that, you know, after my book came out in 2015, I was severely depressed because, you know, I don't know if this is true of all historians, but certainly in my case, I had this exalted sense that the work that I was doing and was going to have a bigger impact than it did. Really tried to capture is the sense of nuance and complexity that might allow us to see past the bitter polarization that prevents us from imagining what's actually happening rather than projecting what we feel has happened. And so I broadly maintain, I still do, that history is the first victim of political polarization. Certainly that's true in Venezuela. But I was severely depressed because, you know, it didn't have that impact. And so I'm like, you know what, I have to do a different project. I can't just keep at it with Venezuela. So I'm going to go study the Middle East. And in particular, I started to do projects around Latin America's influence in the Middle East, rather than what is more commonly studied, which is the Middle East impact in Latin America. And the reality is that there's massive connections. And this was a time when, the Ayatollah was visiting Caracas, Ahmadinejad was visiting Caracas. There were all sorts of treaties being signed as part of this new kind of collaboration between, broadly speaking, like-minded leaders. But the question was always in my mind, like, how does Chavez going to Lebanon? How does Chavez going to meet with Assad? How does Chavez going to Iran? How do Iranians think about that? What do I spent time in the West Bank, and the most dramatic thing that happened to him, in many things, but one of the most dramatic is going to get there's a snack that they sell in Palestine. It's like essentially it's just corn lathered in butter. Not super appetizing, but apparently this is a delicacy. So, but the person that was selling it on the street, the entire cart was covered in images of Hugo Chavez. Why? Because Chavez recognized Palestine as a state, provided massive amounts of political and economic support, eventually brought Palestinian students to medical school in Venezuela and to Cuba. The links are quite clear. And so I was asking him through an interpreter, what does Chavez mean to you? And what he was saying was, Chavez is somebody who supports us, who supports me. And it was that level of personal connection. But it's unsustainable structurally. And let me suggest how. After the bombs first fell in Tehran, the statement that came out of the Venezuelan Foreign Ministry, you should all read it. It couldn't bring itself to condemn it was like well, we support sovereignty, the rule of law, and we wish for this to end soon.
But it did condemn the response to Qatar, actually, which speaks to the money issue. Sorry, I could.
Yeah, you're so right.
But they did condemn the Iranian response.
The Iranian response to Qatar. So to your point, this is such a dramatic shift from what we would have seen, certainly a year ago, perhaps, and certainly under Chavez. But what I think it highlights is that these links are very tenuous. And ultimately, in doing that work on Latin America, Middle East ties, and to think about the question of anti-imperialism, anti-imperialism is refracted highly differently depending on specific local context. So what anti-imperialism means in Iran would be very different from what anti-imperialism means in Mexico or in Jamaica or in Nigeria. And so, I think that the larger question there vis-a-vis, and this is something that you highlighted, why has the response been so muted? In the case of certainly Latin America, where in previous moments you might have not only expected, but you have seen, even beyond whatever ideological fracture there may have been, some sense of preserving or upholding the idea of sovereignty is inviolable, if only for reasons of self-preservation. If it happens to them, it could happen to us, right? And so part of that might be the impact of Venezuelan migration on parts of Latin America and how challenging that has been for countries domestically to contend with. Part of that is also just toxicity associated with Maduro. In terms of upholding a vision of a possible left, right? It's sort of hard to project that particular image with Maduro still in power. But part of it too, and I think this is not that there's many rays of hope here, but even I think that the point of weakness, one point of weakness that one can read into the national security strategy is that it unwittingly asserts two things. One, a return to spheres of influence, understanding of geopolitics, which essentially means that the United States is either implicitly or explicitly surrendering or leaving to, say, China, to your question, that sphere of influence. But also it's attaching its certainly 21st century future to natural resources in a way that, for instance, China, as much as I know about it, is certainly moving away from non-renewables as its future. So simultaneously, you read this document, and you say, okay, you're asserting your supremacy in the hemisphere militarily by way of power. You're saying that we're returning to a moment of spheres of influence there. As a result, we're acknowledging, China's rise in influence. And we're also tying our future to, hydrocarbons and these kinds of natural resources when the future of the world is not in non-renewables, as we know. So, or maybe it's so that could be a moment of tension, but again, it's now in a highly riven context of massive amounts of disunity. Which brings me to your question about China and Russia. Thank you so much. China is not responded at all to what happened on January 3rd. The reality is that yes, China has upwards of $50 billion invested in Venezuela over the last 10 years, 13 years. The $50 billion to China is like, I don't know, a rounding error, right? And so for them, the question is not China. For them, the question is like Peru. China has a massive infrastructure project in a port north of Lima that, if it goes forward, will completely open the Pacific to China in a very direct way. The question of oil, I think China can leave aside. It's not going to get involved in Venezuela's, favor because of $50 billion. But it is highly concerned that the United States is asserting this new kind of doctrinal vision of the hemisphere to cut it off from other trade opportunities. That's, I think, where the clash is going to be. We've not seen it yet. We saw a little bit of it in Panama, where the Panamanian government ended a deal with a Chinese bank to do improvements to the canal on the fear that China is not going to control the canal, right? And so it was very explicitly asserted as we want to make sure that China is not present here. So I think its interests have less to do with Venezuela than what Venezuela means for its vision of the hemisphere. Russia is in a really difficult spot vis-a-vis Venezuela. Obviously, it's highly engaged in Ukraine, but I think is also seeing an opportunity vis-a-vis Ukraine and what's happening now in Iran. And NATO's and Europe's complete fecklessness vis-a-vis the United States, where it can say, well, they're clearly not interested in what's happening in Ukraine. And this is our opportunity to really, assert their own kind of territorial claims, and really under what kind of, certainly not legal, perhaps borderline moral justification, can the United States certainly say, well, now you can't do what we just did in Venezuela. You've been doing it. We did it in Ukraine, and so we're kind of simpatico in that sense. But the problem with Russia, of course, is that it has also invested massively or Venezuela has invested massively in Russian and Belarusian arms and equipment, which you can read what happened on January 3rd as a complete failure of that equipment. That's certainly a very plausible reading. Or there's another one which I kind of have subscribed to, which is that there wasn't a tremendous desire to, as I suggested, fight back in this particular moment. But it certainly leaves, Russian military capability abroad with a huge question mark, which might impair its ability to sell arms elsewhere. So that, I think, is where the Russian concern might be vis-a-vis Venezuela. But no one is crying for Maduro. But one image that I showed before, Delcy and Jorge and Vladimir and Diosdado, the figure between Delcy and Jorge is Nicolásito, Maduro's son, who's the only one really who's talking about his dad. We don't really hear Nicolás from Delcy and Jorge and them anymore. All right, so we have Masaya there, and then Chris. All right. Sure. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Alejandro and Laura, for your comments. I have lots of questions. I'll try to be succinct. Um, the first question is you've provided us with a timeline of kind of understanding where Chavismo comes from and how you characterize it. And we've understood this current moment on the basis of elite politics, right? So how are these government elites responding to this conjuncture? And adaptability is key in your analysis. I want us to also bring into the equation popular politics and knowing your work, Alejandro, I think you're in prime situation to also bring that in. I'm wondering, for example, what's the role of the electoral results of 2024 in the lack of response to what happened in January 3rd? It's really hard for people outside of Venezuela to understand the reaction that Venezuelans have had to these horrendous attacks. And it's in my books, it is among others the consequence of the lack of legitimacy of the government, right? So there is an important element of the elite maneuver, but I wonder, how do you see the popular politics that also plays a role here and has historically been significant to Venezuelan history and to Chavismo, which, again, in my books, has instrumentalized that sort of politics. So I'd like to hear about that. I'm also, because of, again, how Venezuela is read from North America, I'm wondering if we assume, if we agree on the fact that adaptability is Chavismo's main historical characteristic, if this is what holds through time, what's the usefulness of thinking of Chavismo in ideological terms? And what are the limits of those categories? I thought about this, Laura, also as I heard you speak about the infamous meeting in Miami with the extreme right actors of the continent, which by all means we have to take seriously. And I started thinking about the commonalities between Chavismo and many of these regimes, Bukele, for example, that we have given a free pass from the left for a long time. Many have. And then the third, responding also or thinking with you, Laura, about how we lost sight of the role of the military, right? And you made me think of Masaya in 2004, little baby Masaya, feminist activist in South America, meeting with Argentinian feminist elders. And I was a very hopeful Venezuelan at the time. And I'm being super hopeful with this elder, and she says, I wouldn't be so hopeful. And I was like, why? We have the winning cards. And she's like, have you paid attention to the role of the army in this project? And I dismissed her. Mea culpa. Why did we keep dismissing the role of the military? Why did it take us this long? Is my last question.
Chris? Oh, okay, there you go. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah. So my question is going to also relate to the adaptability, the Chavismo regime in Venezuela, and the optimistic argument that you've given about the ability of this regime to adjust, right, to different historical conjunction. So I'm wondering if we look at the moment of US invasion more as a remaking of the world order, right? And here I'm thinking in the in the late 1980s, going into the 1990s, right, there was an argument in global international political economy circles that the US had lost hegemony in the 70s and the 80s, and under the Reagan administration made a concerted effort to re-hegemonize itself, but not on a global scale, on a regional scale. And the instrument that it used to do that was neoliberal free trade. And I remember, doing research in Mexico with some folks in Canada. And the argument in Mexico during that period of time was that the Revolutionary Party, PRI, would be able to withstand the assault, right, on the economic model in Mexico. And at the end of the day, was going to be able to resist, right, a North American free trade agreement. And that didn't happen, right? The PRI, as a consequence of that, lost its political credibility. And a lot of people were predicting that it would be able to reconstitute, but it never reconstituted. Then it was replaced by the PAN. So if we take that perspective, right, and looking at the Trump moment in history as a kind of remaking of American hegemony, then it would signal to me that the adaptability aspect of chavismo, we're probably seeing the end of that story, particularly within the context in which you have shown the correlation between the petroeconomy and the ability of that regime to sustain itself and adapt, right? The American onslaught is, to seize precisely that strategic resource, right? So it's no longer under any kind of economic governance on the part of the Venezuelans, right? So I can see politics and agency still being relevant in Venezuela, but the translation of politics and agency to the basic fundamental characteristics of the regime, you would have to imagine would disappear under this kind of new dispensation that the Trump administration, is out to kind of spur, if you will, the national security doctrine, right? And just to button that down a little bit, if that scenario is not possible at all, could it be because we have to read the Trump administration moment in history as nothing more than an interregnum and not necessarily a permanent structural feature of what the future is?
Thank you. We have Chris to end. Then
Yeah, just a question on the possible implications of the war on Iran. So thinking about this as giving both the US and Venezuelan governments potential room for maneuver, with the possibility that some commentators have raised of persistently very, very high unprecedented oil prices as a result of the closure of the Straits of Hormuz or the de facto closure, et cetera. And so what would be the implications, do you think, of like a persistently unprecedented high oil price for the Venezuelan government, albeit that they don't have full control over the kind of resources that's coming through Qatar, et cetera? And then also with regards to the US government, do you see their kind of now being able to exert this level of control over Venezuelan oil resources as somehow buying them kind of significantly more room to maneuver? I mean, there's been talk about in the press about why didn't the US kind of build up its strategic petroleum reserves in recent decades? It's kind of at an all-time low. But at the same time, I know this isn't the same as a strategic petroleum reserve. It's a kind of longer term or medium term factor, but having access and control in the way that they do over Venezuelan oil resources does seem to kind of buy them significant room to kind of maneuver around these very high oil prices to an extent. So I'm just wondering, I know it's hard to predict the future, but what do you see as being the implications on both sides there?
thank you so much. If I may, I know we're extremely late, so I'm so sorry, and I will ask you just something really quick. And if you have 20 seconds to reflect on this, that would be great. So when it was a fantastic reflection of yours about adaptability as an undercurrent of chavismo, and I definitely agree, and I've also thought about this and reflected, and written on similar things. But when we see the spread of time as being run through adaptability, but one constant that you seem to be bringing back to is the dependence on oil, can make us run the risk of imagining that this is all the result of oil dependency, that we haven't done anything, that we are almost victims of ourselves. And so I would like to bring back one thing that Laura mentioned, which is this tension between agency and structure, and to, if you can squeeze into 20 minutes to say, well, in fact, second, sorry. So in fact, we've done quite a bit.
The answer would just be read Fernando Coronel's The Magical State.
Read it well, right?
Why did we forget? I always tell my students we study what we like. So we don't like the military. So we don't want to spend very much time in their head, right? I think it's partly just method. Like, plus it's so difficult. Plus, we did have democratization, right? So their role seemed to retreat, and in some countries, I think there was a significant improvement in the military.
That's the church. What the hell was the church doing institutionally, because it's in all places?
I would also say, I went back to, some of those early Chavez speeches and that quote that you saw from the slide where Chavez calls himself a soldier. That's all he's been, and that's all he's going to be, a soldier for the people. That was from from the night that he won the elections in 1998. And the cheering is very loud, but the idea of him as a soldier was always part of the larger mythology of Chavez. Going back to 1992, so the notion that the state was so entrenched that only something from within the state could help to unlock it, with the kind of broader support of the people writ large. I think, again, it would require far more ethnographic work than I'm able to do, and perhaps more sociological work. But there is this underlying, not just among Chavez or from Chavez himself, tension between authoritarianism and democratization. I mean, to be very frank, it's very much as part of the opposition as well, right? There's a strong sense of authoritarianism within the opposition too, and so the idea of the military as an institution that can, because rather than despite of what it is, be marshaled at the service of a larger political project. I think we carry that in us. And it's hard to admit. The mea culpa, I think, is a really powerful point. But I don't think it's something we should dismiss. I think in that moment when, to your point as well about the petro state, and is this really a story of just condenados a repetir la historia? To your point about that podcast, which I should say, I did not think that they were going to turn it into like my life story. That was not the. Anyway, we can talk about that later. But I mean, in 2006 and 2007, you could see the massive deepening dependency on oil that was giving rights to all these human development indicators. And very few people were asking the question, is this sustainable over time, or repeating the same models? I remember having this conversation with Francisco Rodriguez at a conference in Yale in 2009, and he was talking about, actually, there's plenty of money in the bank. Like, we could totally withstand a drop in oil price. So there was a real sense that we're not actually repeating this. And I think that the capacity for us, and this it's why I was hearkening to Fernando Coronel's book, The Magical State, where essentially he is making an anthropological argument about Venezuelan culture. The capacity for amnesia is more powerful than the capacity for realism, that we forget easily in order to then believe in a possible future. And you said it really well. when you are sitting on a massive influx of petrodollar, and you have the choice, especially in a context that has preceded it as one where inequality has widened, and you have the possibility to immediately or very quickly affect closing of that gap. What? Magically. You can do so, but not think about its consequences, but rather the immediate political return. It's an extremely difficult, dynamic to break from, I think, sociologically. So, which I think speaks a little bit to your first, and I think that is the most important question. Where's popular politics in all of this? And I would love to hear your thoughts on this yourself, Masaya. The folks that I'm most in contact with are folks who live in this neighborhood that I studied for my book, El 23 de Enero. There's two primary threads I'll bring up. First one is the forced migratory exodus of Venezuelans has hit popular sectors massively. And so just the sense of what that place is now, as opposed to what it was 5, 10 years ago, is quite different. But also the effect of the FAES, the OLP, these police operations that directly targeted popular sectors, ostensibly as a crime-fighting tool, really as political control effort that killed thousands upon thousands upon thousands of extrajudicial assassination or murders of young people, primarily in popular sectors. That was a moment of massive rupture, not only against the idea of what chavismo was, certainly of Maduro. The question that I ask, folks in El 23 that remain there is, well, is there anything left of the project of chavismo? And what is interesting is that they do continue to say, like, right now we have to lay very low because no one in the opposition that we get press is coming to defend us. And the government has tremendous incentive to repress us because we are massive spoilers if we, raise the stake or go out, because the primary leverage that Delcy and them have is stability, right? If there is chaos or even the appearance of semblance of chaos in the streets, they might just throw their lot with a child, because what she's bringing to the table is in terms of a full regime. And so they know that they are quite vulnerable in this moment, so they're very much laying low. But they hold a promise of returning. The notion of return is actually quite important in chavismo. Cada 11 tiene su 3, And, every April 11th has April 13th when Chavez returned. So there is this notion of, we can and will come back. Right? It will be a different visage, but the fact that at the very least we continue to hold power, or the state, or these people hold power, creates the opportunity for a return. So that's some of what I'm hearing, right? At least from the more radical, call it like, the colectivo, La Piedrita and others, when I talk to them, this is what they're telling me. Like, hey, right now we can't really do anything, but it's a little bit more stable, we may be able to return. But you're completely right. I think the elections of 24 and just the outright fraud, so apparent and so naked that it eroded, in any sense, even among some of the harder core chavistas, that democracy in any sort of visage was a part of the, at least Madurista political project. The commonality is such a good point. When I saw the Shield of the Americas thing, I'll say, and feel free to call me out on this. It reminded me a little of some of the meetings during the Pink Tide. So many programs about Sur, UNASUR. Petrocaribe is a slightly different story, but it's there. What at the time felt like a new horizon of possibility for Latin American unity that also was contingent on this resource commodity boom that didn't pan out in terms of longer structural sustainability. So maybe we're seeing something like that now, right? Will there be a Shield of the Americas next year? Will there be a Shield of the Americas? I don't know. Which speaks to your question exactly. right? Is this a contingent interregnal moment in the US? Or does this bespeak a longer lasting structural shift in the way that the US manages to orientation? And I do think that your point is exactly right. I mean, I don't know if intended or unintended, but oil prices are rising. I mean, I just have to fill gas tank, and it was far more expensive than it was 2 weeks before, right? And that does mean, even if it's mediated, that there's more money coming into Venezuela's coffers. And then, guys, no additional production needs to happen for Venezuelan revenues to increase significantly and exponentially. Only by not selling the oil that it already has, 1 million barrels a day, at a non-discounted rate, will yield a significant return. So, does that help? There's in this project of stability, absolutely. And again, the more that it does so, the greater I think the possibility of potential adaptation, with the massive caveat that I could be entirely wrong. So that's why I'm an historian at the end of the day. End with this. Thank you everyone for these amazing and really important questions. Thing that we are not talking about yet in Venezuela, although there's been initial comments, and I was so moved by the land acknowledgement start, is the idea of reconciliation. I've not heard the discussions, substantively about reconciliation in Venezuela. There's so many massive cleavages that we have to reconcile. Internal Venezuela, the diaspora, and Venezuelans in Venezuela, the diaspora itself, and its various cleavages. I've never been so, I'll just say, ashamed to be Venezuelan than when buses were coming into New York City from Texas after the governor's border states were putting Venezuelan migrants and shipping them off to northern cities as a kind of political spectacle, to go to Port Authority hoping and expecting that there would be tons of Venezuelans there reading Venezuelans coming off the buses. There were very few to none, right? And in part, it has to do with these massive cleavages that don't allow us to examine, see past our ingrained sense of polarization. And I hope that, and I don't know when, but I do hope that at some point soon, beyond questions about democratization, when elections will happen, the preceding question should be, how can we reconcile? This is opportunity to do so. But thank you all so much.
Okay, thank you so much for coming. We've ended, and we really appreciate your presence and your questions here. Thank you so much.
There's so